А наш долг постараться, чтобы дети всех народов не знали войны, чтобы у них было спокойное, радостное детство.
In the USSR, and later on in Russia, just like in many other countries around the world, it's very typical for a head of the state to give a discourse on the last day of the year, doing the balance of the year and congratulating the population with the new year. But in Russia, in 1993, something different happened. On the eve of 31st of December, this man came to stage, to the central television, and gave his New Year speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the man who's come all the Russia, who became the deputy of Russian parliament and the man who almost brought down the Russian government, Sergei Mavrodi. When I first heard of this story, I was kind of shocked, not only by the absurdity of it, but by the fact that not so many people outside of Russia know about it. And the more I learn about it, the more it intrigued me, not only because of the protagonist and his story, but mainly about how this story is indicative of what was going on in Russia in that period of time. And despite the main events happening in the 1990s, in order to tell a cohesive story, we need to get back to the 80s. Wait, not these 80s. I'm talking about the USSR 80s. Slowly but steady, I'm trying to study the economy of USSR, which is a very vast and complex topic, but very important topic nonetheless. If you want to understand the fall of the USSR, it's important to understand that the Soviet economy was not a monolith that didn't change all across the 20th century. For the contrary, Soviet economy is composed of different time periods characterized by completely different approaches that had completely different outcomes. Late 80s in the USSR was without a doubt a period of massive change. Change that, if we are being honest, were already a consequence of the 60s, more precisely the reforms implemented by a fake liberal comrade called Kosygin. And one day I'm gonna go more in deep into them, but not today. But very briefly, it was through these reforms that the so-called market started coming into USSR, through different means. Yes, you heard it right. Even before the fall of the USSR, the so-called market was very much present in the USSR, mainly after the 70s, and it was called the dark economy. So when coming close to its fall, the dark economy was valued around 4 to 7% of total GDP, which was a massive number. Still, right now I want to focus on the late 80s, the perestroika time, more precisely 1988, the year when the cooperative reforms were passed. So what were these reforms, and what do they have to do with our story? By the late 80s, the USSR party elite was already fully infected with liberal ideas, and the only solution that they saw to resolve problems caused by the new liberal policy was to implement more liberal policies, which, considering that the structure of the Soviet economy was social and not liberal, later on was one of the main reasons that led to its collapse. There were many reforms, but the ones who are more interesting for our story are so-called cooperative enterprise reform and the market mechanism reform. The first one basically allowed the creation of medium and small businesses in Soviet society, letting them legally operate, because in reality, majority of them already existed and operated. It was them who constituted the majority of shares in so-called dark economy. So now, they could operate legally. This is an important part of our story, because it was under this closure that our main protagonist created his first company, the same one that later will come to scam 50 million Russians, M&M. The other reform that I mentioned was the introduction of open market mechanism that allowed companies and individuals to exchange with the outside world in terms of commodities and currency. This, in a very oversimplified terms, led to a massive scarcity of products in the internal market. While the majority of goods were still produced by the state enterprise, the commercialization of the same goods was done by private entities that, on their side, either engaged in criminal speculation of those goods or simply exported the acquired products to foreign markets for greater profit. It was in this kind of environment that our protagonist first appeared, when in 1989 he, alongside his brother and sister-in-law, created a company known as MMM, a simple company specialized in selling computer hardware that later on will come to shake the entirety of Russia's society. It's important to mention though that he was not alone, and far from being the biggest one. When the collapse of the USSR came, there were already plenty private companies, speculation magnates, and dollar millionaires existing in the Union that contributed extensively to the already existing systematic problems. Although I would like to argue that they themselves were nothing more than a reflection of the system that was the USSR at its end. And don't get me wrong, I myself am a communist and I think the USSR did incredible things. That's why we need to criticize it as much as possible, to understand what it was and what it was not, which I'll try to do, and which we all should try to do. But let's get back to our story. For our protagonist, things changed in the 90s, with our favorite first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, and the dissolution of the USSR. When Yeltsin came to power, he enacted what we now know as shock therapy. The Russian shock therapy that was implemented in the early 90s, with a very high involvement of the Western power and financial institution, was a radical set of economical reforms aimed to transition the country from a centrally planned economy to a market-oriented one. It involved the rapid liberalization of prices, privatization of state-owned assets, and the removal of trade barriers. The shock therapy led to a severe economic contraction, with the Russian GDP plummeting by approximately 50% between 1991 and 1998. This sharp decline in economic output resulted in a protracted recession and soaring of unemployment rate, hyperinflation with annual rates exceeding 2,000%, eroding the savings and the purchasing power of the ordinary citizen. But none of those part of the small elite who in the late 80s already had reserves in the Western currency. Also, poverty rates surged and income inequality widened as a small elite class of oligarchs emerged, controlling significant portion of the economy. These oligarchs were deeply connected with the state, or in other cases were individuals who had already acquired massive wealth during the late 80s, being the biggest advantage the fact that they kept all their wealth in dollars, thus not being affected by the inflation. For the contrary, benefiting from it. The dismantling of Soviet-era social safety nets left many vulnerable populations without essential support, contributing to human crises marked by malnutrition, increase in mortality rates, and decline in life expectancy. The shock therapy also triggered a significant brain drain as skilled professionals immigrated, further exaggerating Russia's economic and social challenges. Overall, the Russia shock therapy has been disastrous, as a consequence, killing the last of the Soviet men and destroying millions of lives all across the ex-USSR, being the only benefactors from this, the ex-party members and their close friends. And this is important to remember, that the elites were not only the ones who were responsible for it, but also the ones who benefit the most, alongside with the Western investors.
For the happiness of our children. The world can sigh in relief. The idol of communism, which spread everywhere social strife, animosity, and unparalleled brutality which instilled fear in humanity, has collapsed. It has collapsed never to rise again. I am here to assure you, we shall not let it rise again in our land.
The end of the Soviet era held a new dawn for Russia, one filled with promises of freedom and prosperity. But the reality was shock therapy, a rapid introduction of market reforms, which was a shock indeed, but not a therapeutic one. Privatization was sold as a path to democratic capitalism, but it played out as a fire sale of nation assets to the few, breeding oligarchs, leaving the masses to fend for themselves in a rapidly polarizing economy. All this was done not only with the blessing from the Western investors, but the enormous profits to them, just as it happened in all countries across ex-Soviet bloc. But wait, you might say, what about all those state assets? How exactly they were privatized? Which is a fair enough question, because even despite all the liberal reforms, till the end, the USSR and its majority of assets in the country were publicly owned, despite some of them being used and commercialized by private entities. They still belonged to the public, which, as you might imagine, was not very convenient for the new bourgeoisie elite and the Western investors. In order to resolve this small issue, Yeltsin and his crew came to a brilliant idea of the voucher system. And of course, when I say they came to this idea, what I really mean is that the Western expert and the Western institution wanted to see it implemented in the space of the ex-USSR, because similar mechanisms were implemented all across the ex-Soviet republics, always with a very big benefit to the Western investors and a small elite. So what was this voucher system that was implemented in the Russian Federation? Yeltsin decided that the best way to deal with this massive amount of public-owned infrastructure was to evaluate the total cost of the infrastructure, which was evaluated then around 1,600,000,000 rubles. Then they took this number and divided it by every person in the country, resulting in around 10,000 rubles per person in form of a voucher that could be cashed out or used to buy shares in Russia's company. As you might rightly assume, this scheme was a total disaster. The population of the recently dissolved Soviet Union had no idea how to operate in a capitalist world full of financial terms, of shares, companies, etc. Even we, who live in a capitalist world, don't fully understand it. So you can imagine the confusion created in the minds of the post-Soviet population. Besides that, the massive amount of hyperinflation caused by the liberal reforms made those vouchers practically useless, forcing the majority of people to cash them out for pennies. And who was buying them? Yes, you guessed it, the Western investors and those small elites, who during the previous eras had managed to create the monetary reserve in foreign currency. Elites that were very highly connected with the state at the time, at least the biggest of them. The result of this system was terrible. It exorbitant and increased poverty and disequality in the country. During these terrible times, our protagonist company was proliferating. In the beginning of the 90s, MMM expands massively. It becomes a bank and an investment broker, but most importantly, it becomes a marketing agency, which will be very important in the future development. Still, with all of this, no signs of becoming Russia's biggest pyramid scheme. Even despite not being close to what would later achieve in terms of profit, MMM was already very profitable business, which was mainly coming from the advertisement part. It's important to remember that we are childs of capitalism. We are completely brain broken by constant and omnipresent advertising. The Soviet people were not. Advertising was almost non-existent in the USSR. People didn't even know what it really was. Logically, they didn't have any defense mechanism against this predative industry, thus making them extremely susceptible to it. Our protagonist used this to his advantage, making a massive ad campaign all across Russia, turning his company into a very widely known brand, which of course brought them massive financials, a success that didn't go unnoticed by the government. And as I mentioned before, the elites and the ex-USSR official were the main benefactors from this new Russian reality. So, they wouldn't allow any outsider to profit without consequence. The consequence came rather quickly. The state interest in MMM company, which let me remind you was not a Ponzi scheme at the time, but just a very profitable company, starting hitting from every side. State-sanctioned pressures, controls, freezing of assets, etc. All this started to fall over this company from every side possible, making its operation and normal functioning quite difficult. Sadly enough, it was from all of this pressure that the infamous Ponzi scheme was born. As a result of constant freezing of assets and negation of bank investment, the company lost all its possibility of external investment. And, as a last resort, Mavrodi created what we now know as MMM Invest, that later will come to be the biggest pyramid scheme in Russia history, and by the lowest estimate, robbing around 50 million Russians. MMM Invest began by buying upper-mentioned vouchers from the ordinary citizen. But where did they get the money to buy those assets? Basically, Mavrovody instituted an investment scheme where people could buy shares in his company, but since it was not totally legal business, he could decide himself the price of the share. So technically, the shares were truly increasing day by day in their value. At this point, it already is a full red flag, but it's important to keep in mind two things. Post-Soviet people had never encountered in their life such things as pyramid schemes or any other form of financial machination, so they were extremely susceptible to it. The second reason is more indicative of the time themselves. Of course, I'm talking about incredible marketing. Ads from MMM were everywhere, all at once. They were at every corner. They were constantly on TV, sponsoring concerts, even free metro ticket rides, and more. Thus, through marketing, Mavrovody managed to create a perfect reputation for his company. Everyone in the country knew about it at the time. The marketing scheme was very effective, because at the time, advertising bombarded Russian populace with image of Western influence, promoting a lifestyle centered around consumption and luxury. So imagine the effect of an ad proposing to make you rich just in a couple of months. Brands become symbols of the new, desired identity, closely tied to the capitalist idea of success and personal achievement. This influx in consumerist values led to a significant cultural shift, where possession started being seen as an extension of the self, an indicator of social standing. And Mavrovody very successfully had already established his brand. Not only that, but the emphasis on material success and individual achievement, hallmarks of the consumer culture propagated through advertisement, marked a significant departure from the collectivist and altruistic values that were characterized by Soviet society. This shift led to a weakening in social bonds and declining community-oriented behavior, fostering the sense of isolation and competition among individuals. The relentless pursuit of ideals promoted by advertisement led to a widespread feeling of inadequacy and dissatisfaction among those who could not attain these materialistic standards. This phenomena contributed to a range of psychological issues, including increasing anxiety, depression, and a pervasive sense of personal failure, as the societal measure for success became increasingly tied to the material wealth and consumption. Of course, this contributed immensely to the growing bubble that was yet to come. As you might have understood by now, the first iteration of the pyramid scheme was a massive success. Millions across Russia joined it. And, as it usually happens in the early stage of any pyramid, people had real returns on the money they put it in, as the initial shares were sold out. Mavrovody decided to emit a second round of shares. But the Russian elite was still not liking the fact that some guy was making money and not sharing. So, using the mechanism of pressure, they didn't allow him to emit more shares to be sold. Mavrodi's response to it was very simple: stop emitting shares. Instead, he started emitting exchangeable tickets that could be bought and then later on exchanged for money, being those tickets not official shares in anything. At this point, it was a massive full-on pyramid scheme, where the profits of all investors were paid by the money brought from the new investor. Because it was really giving people profits, alongside with ever-growing marketing campaign, all of this in an environment where everyone was losing their job, every social nets were destroyed, where basically everything was going to hell, people flowed to them and bought the stick. They looked like a lighthouse in the middle of the storm. At its peak, as described by Mavrovody himself, they were making profits of around $50 million a day. The Russian elite couldn't stand by while so much money was floating around, and in 1994 they arrested Mavrovody and raided his offices. They arrested him on the formality of tax evasion, because technically at the time there didn't exist any other financial legislation that they could use, because the judicial system was just suffering its reforms, and there was nothing against pyramid schemes in it, because not so long ago, such things as a pyramid scheme were unthinkable, much less having illegal mechanisms against them. You would think that would be the end of his story, but not really. They arrested him and obliged him to pay 15 trillion rubles, being the thought behind it that this would put an end to his company, because even for those times, it was a surreal amount of money. but the government didn't have any idea of the scale of his pyramid, because it turned out that Mavroди could pay 2 times this amount very easily every day, because that constituted the daily profit of his company. Even his public support didn't waver with this incident, because the reputation of the company at the time was perfect, due to enormous investment in marketing. On the other hand, the approval of the government of Yeltsin was at all-time lows. The only reason he managed to keep in power was due to Western support, election manipulation, and massive repression of the discontent, including the bombardment of Russian parliament in 1993. So in this paradigm, the government was seen as the bad guy. So if they were after Mavroди, it automatically meant that he was the good guy in the eyes of the population, increasing his already enormous support. There were even demonstrations with thousands of people that demanded the immediate liberation of Mavroди. But once again, at this time, and for the last time, Mavrodi outsmarted the Russian elite. He decided to candidate himself to the Russian parliament, and considering his massive popularity, according to those estimates around 50 million Russians that had invested in MMM at the time, he very easily won his place in Russian parliament, thus gaining deputy immunity, protecting him and his company for any legal prosecution. It's registered that he only went to parliament once during his term, and from the beginning, he was honest, saying that the only reason he'd done it was to gain immunity. The scheme continued till 1997, when, as it always happens with pyramid schemes, it busted. The same year, MMM was proclaimed bankrupt, which led to the immediate prosecution of Mavrodi, who successfully had hid in Moscow till 2003, when he was finally arrested. It's reported that on the day that MMM was declared bankrupt, around 50 million people lost their money. He will get out of prison in 2007 and will try to make several other pyramid schemes, finally dying on a bus stop in March 2018 in Moscow. As you understood by now, this video is not so much about Mavrodi and his scheme, but more about the times. The times that killed the last of the Soviet men. So it was a very experimental video, at least for me in some regard. But in any case, thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did really enjoy what I do, consider subscribing to my channel or becoming a Patreon, or both if you want. Thank you for watching, and solidarity to all.